Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, author of the book Indus-Basin Uninterrupted, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. Dr. Srinivas, Chokkakula, Fellow, Center for Policy Research, India. Dr. Bishnu Upreti, Executive Chairperson, Policy Research Institute, Nepal. And Mr. Sanjay Gupta, Strategy and Policy Advisor, and dear participants. Very good afternoon and good evening to our friends, wherever you're watching us from. Welcome to nice book discussion on Indus-Basin Uninterrupted, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. First, let me briefly introduce Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Issues, and Defense and Security Studies. We mainly focus on 8 major research topics, such as global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, Indo-Pacific affairs, climate change and energy, disaster management, international economy and development, China's Belt and Road Initiative, refugee and migration, and border and transboundary water politics. The issue of border and transboundary water politics has a significant role in shaping the intensities of conflict and cooperation at national and international level. Transboundary water resources can be described as water shared across political, economic, or social boundaries. Shared borders and water resources has always been a political source of potential source of competition. They are the setting for different collaborative decisions which come from their own political, socio-economic, and environmental implications. The research topic comes a closer examination of the different elements in transboundary water and border conflicts, border encroachment, shed light on the challenges concerning the management of border and transboundary water resources, and attempt to make a stronger analytical inquiry to analyze the different elements of the process of border and transboundary water conflict resolution. Hence, today's event is very significant. The event is being streamed live on Facebook. Please do share it on social media and feel free to tweet us about this event. The audience can drop their questions on the Facebook Live or comment in the Zoom chat. Let me first invite the author of the book, Indus-Basin Uninterrupted, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru, by Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, to briefly introduce the book. Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha is a head, Non-Traditional Security Center, Mohan Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. He is a leading scholar and commentator on transboundary rivers, climate change, and the Arctic. After a brief stint in the print media and a doctorate degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University, he joined the MPIDSA in 2001, where he heads the Non-Traditional Security Center and is the managing editor of Strategic Analysis published by Routledge, the Institute's flagship journal. He is a recipient of many fellowship and leadership programs, including Senior Fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, US South Asia Center Engagement Program at the Harvard Kennedy School, Chevening Gurukul Leadership at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a visiting fellow at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Indus Water Basin, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru is his most recent book, published by Penguin this year. His other works include The Ravine Neighborhood, Hydropolitics in South Asia, published by Pentagon in 2016, and Climate Change Narratives, Reading the Arctic in 2014. He edited and co-edited volumes include The Modi Doctrine, New Paradigms in India's Foreign Policy, Non-Traditional Security Challenges in Asia, Approaches and Responses, Arctic, Commerce, Governance and Policy, published by Routledge, and Emerging Strategic Trends in Asia by Pentagon Press in 2015. Dr. Sinha, over to you. You have around 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, for the kind introduction. I hope my voice is not being interrupted.
It's clear, sir.
Thank you. I think you're very kind and very indulgent to find time to bring this book discussion through your platform. I think you're doing quite an extraordinary work by bringing in experts virtually from all over the world. So I compliment you on that. I wish your team and all those who have joined this discussion great resilience in coping with the pandemic. As they say, may the force be with you. These are very difficult times. Let me begin by historical. I am not a historian. I'm a political scientist, and international relation is my discipline. And I know that many full-blooded historians might consider me to be an interloper, probably suggesting that history should be best left to trained historians. While I don't really dispute this, and I appreciate and I respect the historians, I also do believe, and having researched this book, that scholars should increasingly engage with history, irrespective of the discipline one is familiar with. For one, it gives a clearer perspective to some of the contemporary issues one is dealing with. You'll recall William Shakespeare's Tempest. The line goes, "What's past is prologue," meaning that history sets the text. And if you go to the National Archives in Washington, you'll find this quote very, very, symbolic. What's past is prologue. And I say this because when it comes to water issues, particularly transboundary, it requires lots of complex judgments and, the right kind of policy interventions. And therefore, we cannot really be historically ignorant. We have to look at the past through, in a certain sense, the eyes of the present. And the more research I did on the Indus Basin, taking me back to the Indus civilization, I realized that this basin is very typical of this. The more you understand the past, the better prepared you are, I think, to deal with some of the 21st century challenges on the basin. I would also say that I have not written something completely unknown. I say that this is a path-breaking book. What I've done essentially is to unearth a lot of facts and information and try to present it in a very readable way. I think that was the whole idea, that to make history interesting to the readers with the Indus as the background. We know that all rivers around the world carry history. In fact, history itself in certain ways is the history of rivers itself. So I think that was the context, but it has to be, in a certain way related very interestingly. And so I do that, in a sense, gather information, dig deep into the archives, pick out, historical accounts, first-hand information, diaries of various characters that run along the Indus Basin in this 3,500 years. And I put that into a certain easy read. My idea was not merely the Indus Basin as a problem, but try to determine, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how of this narrative. And that was something which I found really interesting when I started writing this book. Also, I think the timing was particularly of importance when I engaged with this exercise. Over the last couple of years, the Indus Basin itself has become very politicized, given the series of events that are happening between India and Pakistan. The 2016 Uri attack, the 2019 Pulwama attack. So there is this constituency in India which is rather bellicose and quite aggressive on how we should look at the Indus Treaty vis-a-vis Pakistan. So there is this interpreting water through an instrument of, a tool of what is called managing Pakistan affairs. Context which give it a certain research relevance. Also, I think in India these days, it's publishers like when you look at things, in history, especially when you're looking at Nehru, and there's so many critical decisions that he undertook. And one of them, of course, was signing the Indus Treaty in 1960. I actually wanted to go deep into the 8 years of negotiation. And I know the World Bank has a lot of archival stuff here, but I just wanted to bring a lot of interesting facts out into the public. Also, there was this wider strategic landscape that, the Indus Basin and the negotiation was affected by. The happenings in Soviet Union, of course, the British Empire itself fading away, and the rise of America and their understanding of South Asia. I think these were some very interesting contexts that added to the whole negotiating process. And I thought in some sense, this was some new knowledge being brought into the public. I also realized while doing the research was the role of the Indian civil engineers, which I thought was much overlooked when we study the Indus Basin and the negotiation, especially their alertness and their strategic interpretation of the headworks was quite significant, and how they communicated to the political leaders who were quite clueless about these headworks and these canals and the strategic aspect of the rivers itself. And that element I thought was one of the crucial knowledge that I gathered through much of the archives and the materials and the diaries and the notes of some of the civil engineers. We all know that the Indus Basin is a civilization, like all great civilizations. But I thought the Indus has a particular peculiarity about it. So there's a distinct impetuosity about the Indus because of the events that has happened. Almost 4,000 years of events around the Indus itself. I think that brings it and gives it a certain distinction that always draws researcher to understand what the Indus is. It's remained a powerful symbol of the passage of time, and it has influenced and sharpened the socio-political landscape. It has brought in numerous institutional structures, legal norms, and of course the technological interventions that have gone to the Indus Basin. And these acquired dimensions, as you scan the history of the Indus Basin, continues to influence the basin in the 21st century. So there is this link of the history and the contemporaneous is very, very strong when it comes to the Indus. I think there are numerous characters. If you read the book, you'll find numerous characters running along the Indus, right up till the Indus Water Treaty in 1960. And they're enormously influenced by concerns of pride, power, envy, fear, desperations from time to time, and many a time just sheer greed, the idea of making profit out of water and irrigation, etc. And their actions and consequences, which I have in some sense recorded in the book, have been, tremendously momentous in the sense of understanding the Indus Basin. Often people have asked me in book discussion is, how different is this book from the others? I would say that when I started this book, I never thought it will end the way it has, and the period of time that is covered is enormous, and probably a lot of people will criticize it, that you can't really cover this enormous period of time in a concise way. But I have, and the effort has been really to draw the interlinkages to the events on the Indus Basin. So you will not find, and the effort has been not to look at a time-dashed way. Each sequence of events is interlinked to the other, and I, in that sense, engage with history, not strictly in the sense of historical inquiry, but by identifying the historical figures, like characters shaping plots and looking into their decisions. And the inquiry frame of the book, and one has to have an inquiry frame, all books need that, is territory and politics. Remember, rivers are very territorial in its presentation, and they are highly political, very emotive, and very divisive. And I think this comes out very clearly through the history that I explore in the book. There is also something about the style which was important for me as an author when you're trying to communicate to what the publisher said, a larger audience. You didn't need a niche audience because it wasn't just about the water practitioners or the water specialists. It was also to make the larger public understand the significance of the basin. And therefore the style also is quite important, which I had to slightly tailor because, I'm also academically trained, and there's a certain way in which one writes academically, tends to be a little pedantic. But I think there is a narrative history here, and you'll be, we are quite familiar with this narrative history these days when we see the works of William Dalrymple or Ramchandra Guha or Shashi Tharoor. They employ this style, and the style is becoming very engaging with a larger audience. So it's an engaging style, and I had to tailor this according to what the publishers demanded, really. You have to write history. I sort of experienced while doing this book that you have to write history that communicates to a larger general audience, and therefore you have to bring in more human elements into your inquiry, into your research, and therefore you'll find a lot of love, greed, power, conquest, jealousy, all being attached as I develop this book. In a sense, I think the book humanizes the Indus rather than merely treats it as an exotic natural wonder. And this was something I experienced, and which was very different from the earlier works that I have done. There are some striking points, and I'll briefly mention 3 that comes out in the book, which for me itself was a learning experience. I realized that there is a continuity of history in terms of knowledge on water management, right? Starting from the Harappans harnessing the flood, inundation irrigation, and their dry farming in the arid plains, that sort of carries even down to the 21st century. Methods like storing rainwater and then channelizing it for irrigation was also very extensively applied in the Indus Basin during the civilization time and later on as well. Evidences of check dams and reservoirs, for example, when we found out in Dholavira, confirms to the fact that hydrological interventions, hydraulic interventions started much early on, and people were quite aware of the decreasing rainfall and the shifting patterns of the rivers. So I think this continuity, this knowledge on water management is quite striking on the Indus Basin. Also, the idea of political legitimacy comes out in the book. The lessons of Indus history are also about water as part of good governance and moral responsibility. When you look at the 9th century Hindu ruler Avanti Varman and the Utpala dynasty in Kashmir, you realize how the bountiful water resources has been sort of harnessed to bring peace and prosperity. Similarly, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he's often been described by historians as the wise fool, but he has undertaken wide-ranging administrative reforms in terms of water management, encouraging farmers to build their own wells, for example. So I think these knowledge are very interesting to capture and shows the continuity of that. In fact, Tughlaq, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, was probably one of the first leaders to have set up a Department of Agriculture called the Diwani-Kohli. So, these are interesting accounts. Or, for example, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, a network of canals that he developed were further upgraded by the Mughal rulers and then by the Britishers themselves. So this interesting continuity is something quite remarkable on the Indus. The third striking aspect which I found was the navigation on the Indus. The British, the East India Company, and their way of looking at the rivers was in terms of navigation, and this is almost now forgotten on the Indus today. We don't really talk about navigation on Indus, and this was fantastically exploited by the East India Company merchants when they set up their businesses. And they often noted, and they have noted in their diaries and notes, great enthusiasm on some of the stretches of the Indus, particularly from Multan to the sea, which they calculated was very navigable throughout the year. Also, interesting accounts in this book, I feel, is those face-to-face on the banks of the rivers, the invaders when they came and when they had to accost the rulers of the land. The battle scenes, this face-to-face engagement, offers a rather dramatic outcome of the Indus Basin. And it starts off with Alexander Porus. And I've described Porus in some of the work from the archives, is that he's a child of the monsoon. He knows very well the flow, the ebb and the flow of the river. And finally, of course, the face-to-face encounter between Genghis Khan and Jalaluddin is also very interesting. And I relate all that in the book, especially when you develop battle tactics and military approaches with the river around you. Also accounts through the foreign travelers who came to the Indus Basin, and they chronicled it very diligently in their diaries, starting from Al-Baladuri to Al-Masudi, Al-Baroni, Ibn Battuta. All these travelers who came were mightily impressed by the Indus River, and they noted it in their accounts, which is quite important when you capture it and just signifies what they thought about the river and the social and economic sort of engagement of the time. There are also certain revelations that came to me when I was doing this book. The first revelation, I think, was how the British looked at the trans-Indus in terms of territory and diplomacy, especially when they were engaging with Afghanistan. You know, they treated the trans-Indus part as the panic zone, you know, and that's you'll find in part 2 of the book called Diplomacy and Commerce on the Indus. And the role that Lord Minto played with his 3 wise men, you know, John Malcolm, Mount Stuart, Elphinstone, and Metcalfe, is captured in the book. And the period of time, the diplomacy also was about geographic detailing. They really, you know, outlined the river, its turn, its flow. It was also an exercise of intelligence gathering. You know, the British were very good at detailing things, doing surveys, you know, observing the social hierarchy around it, etc., etc. And so that's a very interesting account of the British engagement on the Indus itself. Then I think the revelation of the civil engineers, as I mentioned earlier, during the partition time, is also captured well, and their sort of communication with Nehru and the various other Indian leaders in explaining to them the significance of the headworks and how, as many accounts reveal, the partition line was shifted more in favor of India. And I think the driving factor here was the control of the headwork. But I think by all accounts, and especially given the current context, the political context today, I think the most fascinating aspect comes across as how Nehru prevailed over the debate in Parliament, which was largely questioning the Indus Treaty, you know, and he was very supremely confident that his worldview and his understanding of diplomacy would prevail over the dissent that was emerging in the Parliament. Even the mainstream newspaper, and I looked at many of the newspapers during that time, had often criticized India for giving away too much to Pakistan. You know, one of the headlines of the newspaper said, "Concessions after concessions," and a number of parliamentarians in the Parliament during the debate reflected the larger mood of the public. I think they often questioned Nehru for conceding too much to Pakistan. In fact, there was a debate saying that if we had given waters to Pakistan in 1948 as a human consideration, probably we would not need to have signed the treaty in 1960 and saved many of the embarrassments that they had to go through. But but Nehru prevailed, and that's the personality of Nehru. One can see, and one can examine this personality vis-a-vis the Indus Treaty. And Nehru completely has a different take, and he would often say, and I've quoted many of his statements, saying that, you know, in the light of his foreign policy approach, one should not miss the larger picture. You know, the bigger picture was very important to Nehru. He would always say, it is the context that we have to consider, not a particular bit. And I think in the case of the treaty, the Indus Treaty, Nehru, you know, felt truly that it was a price worth paying, you know, and he had expressed his great disappointment over how the Parliament, the House, the Lok Sabha was treating this treaty, you know, in a very narrow-minded spirit. That's what he told the parliamentarians, and that they had to come out of this narrow-minded frame of looking at the treaty, because there was a larger objective of peace that he wanted to have in South Asia. And he often would praise the engineers, and that it was the engineers' a mind frame that was determining the whole negotiating process. Anyway, but there was an Nehruvian internationalist mindset to the entire water issue with Pakistan. So this brings me to the present day, and the present day is all about the treaty, and we look at it more in terms of retrospective analysis. You know, the treaty had a limited objective to fulfill, which I think it did in 1960. And as I write in the end, the Indus Water Treaty neither had an overriding political objective, nor was it intended to be an exercise in peacemaking. It was at best a classical lesson in international mediation. And the principal objective was to deal with the problem of geography and irrigation development in the Indus region, as a result, of course, of the partition and the competing sovereignty that followed. And one can argue today, again, in retrospect, that the division of the river system into these two segments, Eastern and Western, was not probably the most ingenious of the solutions. And probably, a formula like a joint integrated planning and management, which actually Cyril Ratcliffe, when he was partitioning the boundary, had thought about in the first place, would be probably more practical when you look at it in the current context. But these are, again, as I said, retrospective. But of course, it does gain salience when one looks at the basin as a whole today, as an integrated ecosystem, and not one as a divided political boundary. So the reality today, I think, is that the political boundary still determines the basin. The sovereign is still supreme, and interests are supreme. So we have not come to the point of treating the Indus Basin as a wholesome value or as a joint basin management. So inevitably, each time when there's a problem, we fall back on the treaty itself. So this, in a sense, is what the book is. And it can only be judged by reading it. And I hope people do go and read it. But I think more important is the idea in the book is to encourage further research and to bring out more documents and references and papers that might fill in the gaps. History always has gaps that requires to be filled. And this probably is the real essence of the book, in a certain sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha, for the overview of the book. Let me now invite other speakers to comment on the book. Mr. Deepak Gewali, former Minister of Water Resources of Nepal, could not join us because of some medical emergencies at home. So please allow me to invite Dr. Srinivas Chokkakula, a fellow, Center for Policy Research, India, to comment on the book. Dr. Srinivas Chokkakula is fellow at Center for Policy Research and Ministry of Jal Shakti Research Chair, Water Conflict and Governance at CPR, where he leads the Trans-Boundary River Ecologies and Development Studies program. His research and policy interest lies primarily in the water sector, focusing on trans-boundary water conflict and cooperation and governance. He has written and published widely on the topic, both in academic journals and mainstream outlets. His interest extends to the broader area of politics of infrastructure development, including inland waterways, smart cities, and rural roads. As the MOJS research chair, he engages closely with relevant government agencies and is often consulted on various water policy and institutional issues. Srinivas is currently a member of the drafting committee of India's National Water Policy. Before his PhD and the shift to academics, Srinivas worked as a professional, engaging with wide-ranging topics including urban and regional planning and local governance in India, disaster responses and reconstruction, and indigenous knowledge system for natural resources management. He has received several scholarships and fellowships, including the British Council's Chevening Scholarship in the Young Indian Environmental Managers Program. As a keen supporter of non-profit sector, Srinivas has founded and served and has been serving on the board of various organizations. He has an interdisciplinary training in geography, planning, and engineering. He holds a PhD from University of Washington, Seattle, and a master from University of Miami, Florida, in political geography, and earlier masters in urban environmental planning from CEPT University, Ahmedabad, and BTech in civil engineering from Kakatiya University, Warangal. Over to you, sir. Please make a comment in 10 to 12 minutes.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, for that very generous and prolonged introduction. I'd like to just first of all, and also congratulate you on this very important event that you thought of. And because, as I would say, and I would make an argument, this is one of those rare books that you get on this very important issue. First of all, let me just start off by congratulating Uttam for a fantastic book. In fact, having known Uttam and having interacted with him on various policy-related issues, I had certain assumptions about the kind of book that he would write about Indus. And the book has completely surprised me. And as it did, he did himself say that he did not pursue it as a kind of political scientist or otherwise someone known in international relations, but more as a historian. That itself actually, sort of surprised me, and pleasantly so. In fact, I should again congratulate Uttam for his very interesting way that he presented the book in the past 20 minutes. I think, let me just, I have to confess before I get on with what I wanted to say, because we haven't talked before this conversation, but you would end up me pretty much echoing quite a few things that he had already said, which basically, I think, tells something about the book. I think the way he has written and the kind of effort that he has put to communicate certain messages, they did reach me. And I think he should be pleased about it, that I completely kind of, I can echo his own, the way he presented the striking features of the book and the way he visualized the book. And I will try to reduce that repetition of what he said, but you would still see that I'm pretty much echoing what he said. In fact, it is actually what I have to, I think I end up using the same words that he would use, but as I'm a different kind of interloper, you might say, because having been an engineer and then trained in political geography, which I keep saying that this is a discipline, geography is a discipline which suffers, not suffers, but enjoys, I guess, in the glory of perpetual identity crisis, as a discipline. But it does, in my view, I think it has helped me in several ways in bringing a kind of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary view. And let me just try, share my view about how I looked at the book and how I have read it and how I benefited from it, reading it. In fact, the book, as he did say, is actually very interestingly, those people, I think Uttam himself has deliberately, apparently avoided getting into more academic jargon, or otherwise deeper theoretical engagement, because he wanted the book to be a little bit more widely appealing. But otherwise, it's a kind of genealogical history of Indus-Water Treaty. And in fact, put in a very simple terms, it is the history of the present. And that history of the present is what comes out of this book very strongly. In fact, that is the biggest, that makes that history of the present, the way the Indus-Water Treaty itself is, first of all, materialized and is perceived. You can actually find a lot of explanation in this historical exposition that Uttam offers in this book. In fact, it's quite, I'm sure he has thought about it like this, but I have had my own vision of when I read the book and reflected over it. I thought it was a very interesting way it was organized into 5 parts. Of course, it is quite readable and very engaging. In fact, the first part that I thought, though it is very dense, and considering the kind of diverse material that he uses and he engages with and brings in very interesting perspectives and insights and stories to tell a much bigger story, which is very engaging, very attractive. And I thought it's the first part, the way I looked at it, is that it is about showing, in fact, which is right now, that is what has happened, I think, is that how rivers, and particularly Indus River, has been central to not just civilization, but also the conquests, and then politics of territory making as well as marking. I think that is, in fact, the first part actually puts it with bringing in real historical geographies of this particular Indus Basin. I think it also basically, as I did say, and as Uttam himself has mentioned about it, it also brings out how various progressive rulers, besides the kind of very interesting dramatic stories about how various invaders tried to use the river as well as were affected and impacted by the river in their own plans of conquering the basin, and how but also besides that, I think he book brings in very interesting ways of how progressive rulers, one after another, have tried to deal with the unpredictability and the kind of very particularly ravaging flood risk that is there in the basin. I think the first part actually tells you how the civilization as well as the kind of politics and territorial politics were shaped by the fundamental geography and ecology of the river. And the second one is, in fact, very interestingly, the modern history of territorialization of space, but through colonization. So you see that you will see the way the empire, the British Empire, not just the British Empire, but otherwise also, but most outstanding is the British Empire, how it deployed various kinds of technologies of power, particularly the knowledge, drawing on the knowledge, I mean, how they have used it for conquest and also subjugation territories. If you look at, I mean, there are quite a few interesting and commonalities across the board for the way the British Empire was built. If you look at it, there are these, particularly what struck me most was the way the cartography and surveying was used by the British explorers. I mean, I think it is something to do with the way the culture of conquest, if you want to call it at the time, how surveying, exploration, and cartography was encouraged. In fact, the very production of knowledge about space itself was a very important technology of power for the British Empire and then in empire building. And the very interesting story about how the chief of Kutch, traveling from sea to Shikaripur, that is, I think he's called Burns, who mapped the entire geography of Indus, and then eventually it has become a tool for the planners of the British Empire to plan their conquests later. And then you see Burns' own decapitation, the rings sort of echoes with another story that I have heard in other books where, the British Empire, when they were trying to expand their territory in Ireland, in fact, the Crown's surveyor, John Bartlett, was actually decapitated because they wanted the Crown not to know about the existence of Ireland. There's a very interesting way that critical geographers bring in how geography, production of the knowledge about space and about geography itself is a tool for territorial making. I think the third part, in fact, besides that, in fact, it basically it is again more of a territorialization of space, but in a decolonized history of politics of territory within South Asia, between India and Pakistan partitioning. And I think that's what is interesting, and I thought I would have liked more, is about the territorialization of water. That the story about the way attaching territorial identity for about the use of water or otherwise ownership of water. Actually that story begins in the third part. And then obviously, about the fourth and fifth part about more decolonized histories, if I may say, about how India and Pakistan partitioned and then the making of the Indus Treaty, bringing in various kinds of international power dynamics that actually pretty much makes it inevitable that the only direction of making peace work in Indus Basin was to have the kind of treaty that it has been. I think that is where this is extremely successful, is to build that case for the kind of treaty that is in place. In my view, that is how I have read it, is that I didn't find any alternative way. And I think thanks to the kind of thinking that at the time, the leaders at the time like Jawaharlal Nehru had about the bigger picture, the bigger context is about peace building in this otherwise deeply distressed land at the time, I think is the most important part. And he was also having that hope that this would become the beginning of cooperation between otherwise antagonizing territories in making India and Pakistan. But I think besides that, I would come back to that Nehru's view, but I think given that this kind of structuring of the book, and then in fact, he didn't mention it, but otherwise I did say that it is a rare book because I think if you look at the literature about Indus Water Treaty, of course, there are more journal and other kind of serious scholarly writings. But if you look at the readable and accessible books, there are very few of them. In fact, Andala, I don't think she has published her book. But the only other book that I can think about, departing from the legal narratives or otherwise legalist narratives, if I may say, of Salman and others, the only book that stands out is both by Penguin Publishers, by the way, incidentally. One, I think Daniel Haynes, I think it was in 2015, it was published, and now it is Uttam's that brings out this. But I think it is also very different from those books, in fact. While those works, Andala and Daniel Haynes actually try to engage with that theoretical background and basically lose some appeal, if I may say, or the richness of empirical insights that one can bring. And that's how I think this book stands out totally in bringing that empirical material from really, really diverse and vast resources, and actually gives an entirely different kind of perspectives in the narratives that brought out earlier. And in fact, they make you doubt about some of those narratives that you were aware of when you look at this empirical material that this book offers. And I think it is basically, as I did say, that exposure to that kind of rich and very detailed empirical information, that and the kind of possibilities for further research, as Uttam mentioned, I think is the most important aspect of this book. I'll just come to those issues that I really wanted that we could actually address, that triggered my own thinking about, puzzles that I would like to look into in the future. But I would like to just reiterate that it's a very readable book, and also sometimes even regaling with these stories, very interesting stories, but with a profound sense of importance. And let me just share it with you about this very interesting story of 18-year-old general of the Khalifa from Baghdad, Qasim, in the 8th century, when he conquered, was it Multan, Sindh, and vs. Naipaul. In fact, actually, I would like to look up how he built that. In fact, it is the kind of Islamic beginning of the Pakistan state. You're talking about 8th century movement. But that story itself is a very interesting story of all kinds of emotional that you were talking about: jealousy, distress, and power, greed. And Qasim, who was just 18-year-old, and he just, and meets early death on a pretty much foolish reason, for foolish reasons. And so that humanizing, or otherwise that kind of storytelling, personalizing the story, telling with a very important narrative, I think is what this book kind of stands out. So as I did say, the couple of things, and not more than, in fact, several questions that I have started listing down, but I'll just share because we don't have much time. But I really wanted, in fact, the moment that I thought when the real territorialization of water resources that has happened was the shift from centralized water resources governments under the East India, and in fact, not under the British rule, and provincializing of water resources, which is basically a different kind of territorialization of water resources that we are now grappling with when it comes to interstate water disputes, has begun with that, enacting of 1873 Act, Northern, I think that was Northern Canal and Drainage Act, which was replicated in other provinces as well, the British provinces. I would have liked more about what were the politics out there, and I think it would be really interesting to know. And he also raised, I think, Uttam raises this very important debate, I think, which has really, really important relevance at the moment in the current moment, is that Ramesh Datta's debate about irrigation, about whether the public, it should be a public enterprise, irrigation development and provision of irrigation services should be a public enterprise, or otherwise should it be a private enterprise. I think that's a very important question. And I would have loved to know more about what was the kind of rationalities to maintain that, that it should be a public enterprise, and whether, and that is the advantage of taking a historical perspective, is that whether any kind of shift makes sense in the contemporary times. It's a very important question. And again, I mean, I think at one point, this book mentions about Jinnah's own rather myopic view about, in fact, not just Jinnah's, in fact, pretty much any political leader's myopic view about hydraulics or otherwise the ecology or geography of rivers has led to certain kind of tensions eventually, even though it was at the moment, the partition, at that time, the partition was entirely driven by the demographics and the kind of religious composition, but very little was given. And pretty much if you look at the narrative, I think the challenges that were posed by the rivers and river sharing were dealt with as they went on. I mean, it was a kind of ex post treatment of river sharing rather than a kind of ex ante thinking about what kind of implications would we have when it comes to re-territorialization. I mean, that kind of problems, if you look at interstate water disputes, we continue with the same kind of ex post thinking about water resources sharing. We instantly ex ante thinking about, if you look at any interstate river water disputes that we have at the moment, they always have this background of reorganization of states. And you take the recent most reorganization of states, it was just given to this, that the certain kind of boards would actually deal with the problems that they would have in sharing waters. And as you know, the territorialization, the sense of territorialization of water resources have led to escalation of disputes. I think we may want to learn a bit more about how the river water sharing should perhaps precede any thinking about re-territorialization of space itself. I think that is a kind of hypothetical thinking that we should actually bring in our policy conversations. I mean, the last but definitely not the least, I just wanted to highlight here is that very important issue that Uttam repeatedly has mentioned in his introductions is the role of civil engineers. And I think the story about civil engineers or the engineering community in re-territorialization of water resources or space is something that is a kind of suppressed history. And if you look at the narratives, very unfortunately. In fact, Daniel Haynes, also the previous book, also refers to this, and in fact, pretty much expresses that the inability to grapple the technicalities involved in it, in explaining the rationalities of Indus water treaty making. And Uttam also makes a fairly good attempt, but I think I felt that this is something definitely is a neglected set of narratives. I mean, if you look at the whole story of how irrigation development has happened since the 1850s onwards, in both in the northwestern parts of India as well as southern parts of India, particularly Krishna and Godavari deltas and Kaveri deltas, and also in here in Indus Basin. These are primed for a green revolution. I think if you could look at it, I mean, that is why irrigation development there was assured irrigation development that has already happened for the green revolution to take off. And if you look at narratives of the green revolution, you often attribute this to 3 S's in India, which is the then finance minister Subramaniam, and then the finance secretary, I think, V. Sivaraman, and then the third one, M.S. Swaminathan, who's the third S. And they talk about primarily it is about the varieties driven, the new varieties driven green revolution, but doesn't adequately give space for the narratives from the engineers who made it possible for the irrigation to be assured for the takeoff. That gap in their contributions, not just necessarily contributions, but the discipline's contribution and the kind of the stories involved in irrigation development. I think that needs to be addressed in the future. Is something, thanks to this book, highlighting that as well as the previous book as well. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, that's what I thought. In fact, the only complaint, if you want to call it, is that when the book was closed with unconvincingly convincing Nehru, I felt that while the personality of Nehru as an internationalist and a kind of statesman has helped that narrative about him raising about those criticisms and then prevailing over it. But I think a little bit of help from the technical rationalities that the engineers have provided in apparently and perceived as a perceived compromised position in making the industry have helped. For example, people like Niranjan Gulati and others, though they have their own narratives, but I think to bring that politics and the technological narratives would have been extremely helpful. I think that is something that I would look forward to in the future, and perhaps it would encourage other scholars to pick up on that, who can understand both technology and politics. But otherwise, for the audience, I have no hesitation in recommending strongly this book, and I have enjoyed totally, and you will enjoy it too. That's what I would say, and I would stop it here. I hope that I was within time, or maybe a little bit exceeded time. But thank you again, Uttam, for this fantastic book.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. Thank you very much for your comments. Now we'd like to invite Dr. Bishnu Upreti, Executive Chairperson of Policy Research Institute. Dr. Bishnu Upreti holds PhD in Conflict Management and MSc in Knowledge System Management from Wageningen University, the Netherlands, and Master in Sociology from Tribhuvan University, Nepal. Dr. Upreti has worked as a research fellow at the King's College, University of London, and the Center for Environmental Strategy, University of Surrey, UK. In the 40 years of experience in the field of development from 1990 to 1996 in research, from 1996 to date, he has been working actively. He served as South Asia coordinator of a global research program called NCCR, North, South, and Senior Research, focusing on state building, peace and unconventional security, water, food, health, environmental security, governance, and North-South research partnership. Dr. Upreti was a regular visiting scholar in different US and European universities and research centers. His teaching and research are mainly focused on social and public policy, conflict management, and state building issues. He has written and co-edited nearly 6 books, published frequently in international peer-reviewed journals, and extensively contributed chapters in anthologies and edited volumes. He is widely quoted in national and international media. Dr. Upreti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. Can you hear me? My internet is quite unstable, so I am a bit worried. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you clearly, but we can't see you.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, we can see you.
It should be okay. Yeah. First of all, thank you for giving this opportunity to go through this very exciting book. Dr. Jaiswal, it was really nice to be in this gathering. Second, I congratulate Dr. Datta for bringing this very rigorous and comprehensive book entitled A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. Its title is a bit long, but it gives everything what people want to know by its title itself. It's really comprehensive historical overview of the multifaceted issues related to the Indus-Basin and broader Indus civilization. It's river civilization, this developed culture, and its related economy, agriculture, irrigation, and politics. Everything is embedded, so it's quite a comprehensive book, and it is also a great opportunity for readers to learn and know more from that book. Uttam himself acknowledges the important resource he generated while working with this Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and so many interesting historical essays and this undercurrent negotiation and document. So the approach he made to develop this book was quite unique, and I realized it was very rarely done by the social scientist or the sociologist or political scientist, going through the historical route and digging out this type of material. And sometimes I myself feel incompetent to do so because historians have their own position and stand. So in that sense, it was really very unique way of development of the book and bringing the perspective of such renowned scholars and also the politician, the negotiator. It was so good. All of us know Dr. Sinha is one of the leading scholars in the transboundary, water issues in the region. The riverine neighborhood hydropolitics in is the very clear evidences of that is competency, and also leading the unconventional security issues, and the department in IDSA itself is evidence of his thematic competency in the region. So here I will not be bringing the comprehensive critics of the book, because this is so comprehensive and so strong. What I will try to do is basically reflect on how I realize it, how important it is, and mainly being a scholar and researcher in the conflict, water conflict and cooperation, I will try to look from that angle. The subtitle of the book, the history of territory and politics. This extends the focus of the book, and also the emphasis of the book, and the time spans covered. It was such a huge time spans covered by the single book with such a diverse area presenting in these 5 parts. Is quite a unique one. This book has nicely narrated the history of Indus-Basin for a curious reader. Those who want to know the ancient development and its relation at the present Indo-Pak relation. So it has a very unique way. For those staying abroad, Indian and Pakistani, they have their own perspective, but for others, foreigner, it gives the very different dimension to read on. So maybe the countries, they have the emotional dimension. For us, it gives the very different but nicely narrated history to understand how it happened, why it happened. So in that sense, this book also reflects the interpretation of the river, the military tactics, and also this invasion procedures, and politics of building the irrigation infrastructure, and the role of civil engineer up to the time of the negotiation. So these are really unique. You see, I tried to write so many books, but I never tried to do in that comprehensive way, taking entirely different approach, historical approach, and bringing chronological evidences to put for the reader. So in that sense, again, Uttam is providing us a very unique scenario, and I am sure international reader will be more happy to know the India-Pakistani dynamics. And also this book comes in such a crucial time of the COVID pandemics and challenges, and also people discussing about thinking of the new world order. So when we are talking about the new world order, this book is a very right foundation to rethink about the new world order in the Indus water negotiation, Indus-Basin. Pandemic is not only forcing us to think on the health-related issue, but also forcing us to think about our behavior, social behavior, political behavior, individual behavior, and also our day-to-day practices. So to understand the dynamics of that region and its political relation, it will be very right time to look the perspective brought here and develop on that. So even for the entire new perspective of looking from the new world order and the water cooperation dynamics, it gives the another impetus, and we really appreciate this type of the thinking on the book. All of us who are working in the water related issue, water conflict and cooperation issue, know that rivers are not only the water, they have the main socio-political dimension, unique history in terms of process of negotiation, use of water, associated development, irrigation infrastructure, and trade, and so on and so forth. And that is even more important in the transboundary river, and this Indus River is one of the very key global example of these association and complication. In any transboundary water conflict or cooperation, the Indus Water Treaty is also the reservoir of the knowledge for us to learn, and that Uttam has documented this knowledge very nicely to look from different angles, as I shared earlier, from the political, historical, and cultural way. So another important question for me as a conflict researcher, in the context of such a tense situation, tense relation between these two countries, how this treaty is sustained for more than 6 decades. So what are the key lessons the world can learn from that negotiation, how it was able to cope with these three or even 4 wars between these two countries, and still it is operating and it is functional. However, there are some political debate could be affecting to that understanding, because the politician, especially the Indian politician, in my observation, are using that Indus Treaty as a means of threat to pursuing the Pakistan to abrogating the treaty. And is it really India wants to abrogate that treaty, or it is just a threat to get more from it, or to realize the Pakistan, the difficult situation if that happens? So it is one of the obvious issue which need further debate and discussion. Other political and security related tension are really contributing to that process, in my understanding, and that may be the reason that many Indian politicians and even some group of analysts think that it is really a means to threaten the Pakistan. But for me, it is either to catch the sentiment of the voters or to optimize the benefit of the treaty for the India. That may be the reason. Later it may be further discussed, and the Indian colleagues and Indian scholars present here may explain that. It may be my little understanding about that. The signing of this Indus Treaty in 1960 was the outcome of the undercurrent negotiation of 8 years. Uttam wrote, that means if we want to engage meaningfully with this high level of the negotiator, how critical it is. So either India-Nepal water negotiation or the India-Bangladesh or any transboundary water negotiation, that is another very nice learning lessons for us to engage, to explore all dimensions of the negotiation and prepare for so many years. And also, very interestingly, Uttam also brought this to interest at that time with the USA and USSR, and their dimension scrutinized during that process. It was also quite interesting part. Historically, irrigation is mainly related with the agriculture, but when reading to the book, it is not so. Irrigation is one part. There is so many other parts related with the water. There are so many other trade-related issues, and even the military and political issues. So in that sense, it was very excellent way of looking to the complexity by taking the river system as a complex whole and know the behavior, manner of the key actors and stakeholders engaged at that time. So when I look to the current debate, even I realize that there is a question about the relevance of the usefulness of this treaty in the current political situation, and particularly in the current political leadership. So is it the right way to think in questioning about that? I believe it is not. The sustainability is absolutely essential, but managing the transboundary river like the Indus River is not only complex and require the political commitment from both sides, and also comprehensive understanding of the um, multidimensional functioning of this river basin and this treaty, and also collective and concerted action from the key stakeholders engaged in that river system and the treaty, including politicians, the bureaucrat, the administrator, and the technocrats, as well as forging the technological solution and knowledge base. Perhaps the scarcity of water is one of the obvious reason of the tension between the two, and then use of the technology could provide some sort of options if there is a political commitment. Of course, what's here is a zero game if someone takes and others goes. But if there is a willingness to collaborate, it can always be a win-win situation by working together in a collaboration to find the solution. And that solution, creative solution, the technology can really help. So in my understanding, this rich history, culture, agriculture, and the Hindu civilization is far beyond the political interest of the two countries. Therefore, it is always better to have a powerful mechanism to address and this Indus River Treaty in specific, and the politics, culture, and history of the Indus River Basin in general is a powerful means of collaboration for the win-win solution of the both the countries. A lot of lessons for the globe to learn from, and also to act in a concerted way. So once again, congratulations, Uttamji, for bringing this very interesting, nice book. All of us, even the foreigner, needs to read that more because it has a very unique opportunity and unique offering for us to know and go more and understand more. And I wish to all of us, all of you, to stay safe in this difficult time of the COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Upreti, for your comments, and we wish you good health as well. May I now ask the next speaker, Mr. Sanjay Gupta, Strategy and Policy Advisor, to make his comments. Sanjay has over 2 decades of senior level experience in strategy, advice, and policy advocacy in the area of water resource management, water and sanitation, environment and climate change, gender, and livelihood across South and Central Asia, in Europe and the United States. He has worked for the World Bank, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Asian Development Bank, the US House of Representatives, Malcolm University, international NGOs, and the private sector. He has also been a member of the Track to Dialogue on Indus River Cooperation between India and Pakistan. He has master's degree in communication from development from Malmö University, Sweden, a master's of science in marine environmental science from University of Stony Brook, New York, United States, and a BSc honors in physics from St. Stephen's College, University of London, University of Delhi, India. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll be brief. I do realize I think there is a lot of time still required for the questions. Okay, let's start with the first point. I think while I think Uttam points out quite clearly that emotion perhaps played a role over centuries, I mean, how much did emotion really play a role in India's negotiation? I think that is perhaps, I think more important to understand. I mean, did Nehru, being a leader, of the freedom movement, did he feel that people of Pakistan were his own people? I mean, he really didn't see this as a negotiation between two countries, but rather, between two entities which were equally dear to him. After all, he was the leader, of the joint unindependent India, so to say. And my feeling is that perhaps did play a role in his so-called largesse, that he felt that, people of India owed, because it was the same, really. His whole, this internationalism, I think that has come out. I mean, did that also arise, for example, this whole thing of India being the big brother in the region, or the fact that, India is the upper riparian? I mean, how much did that play a role really in his thinking? And I mean, I think that it comes out very clearly in the book always that, technocratic solutions were always subservient to politics and emotions, and I think that remains to this day. It's not as if it has really changed, despite, I think, the Indus commissioners being kind of, technocrats, engineers, and they being doing regular meetings. Finally, it is really, the politics, the emotions that determine, everything. And it's nice to understand. And it becomes even more important to understand those, because did then the treaty, the whole backlash that Nehru faced, did that determine what I would say is how India proceeded ahead with the Farakka barrage? Because Farakka barrage, India proceeded completely unilaterally against what was then East Pakistan. It wasn't Bangladesh. When the whole Farakka barrage, the construction began, the design took place, etc. For Bangladesh, when it became an independent country, it was something that it just got on its place, Or, did the treaty? Nepal is often, I think, accused India of acting like a big brother in the subsequent treaties, that were signed. Did India become jaded after, I think, Indus Treaty signing and, giving a largesse to a neighboring country? So did it affect the negotiations with other countries or behavior of the countries? I think that is something quite important to explore, I would say, for a political economist or for a historian. I think that becomes very important. The second thing, what I would say, is the rigid nature of the treaty. It is truly a treaty of words, not in spirit. Let us accept that. But that is what has kept, when people say, okay, it is a great treaty. It has gone through so many wars, it has survived so many wars. Yes, it's a great treaty because it is a very rigid treaty. But the rigidity being the factor for its success is also the factor for its, if you look at is it really flexible enough to look at emerging issues such as climate change? Issues such as commerce, for example, waterways, which was one of the key, I think, entry points for Britishers. Why they entered, from what I could interpret, is it was really commerce on the river, which was their strong interest when they came, started really thinking of having much more influence on controlling the river, And so this whole waterways thing, we know that on the eastern flank of India, National Waterways 1, National Waterways 2, we are linking up with the BBI, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, and the coastal, seas. We are linking up in a huge way now, But on the western flank, we really don't have. It's not even under consideration. Forget about actually being under plan, or those kind of things. And it is the rigid nature of the treaty which is really preventing, what I would say. And my feeling is what happened to Indus Valley civilization will happen sooner or later, probably later, not right now, maybe in the next 50 years, maybe in the next 100 years. That is the thing that will happen if we really retain the treaty as it is and don't really we don't really adapt, I think, to the emerging climate change challenges that are coming on. We will relive that history which the Indus Valley civilization really went through and probably, was completely wiped out to a great extent, The third point I would like to really look at it is, I think if you really look at the Ganges basin on one side, we know very little about hydrology of the basin compared to, let's say, hydrology of the Indus basin. Simply it's much more because it's a contested space. So I guess we really have focused a lot more on the hydrology of Indus basin vis-a-vis, let's say, on the Ganges basin. But we know a lot more about the socio-economic issues. the socio-economic benefits. For example, all the treaties of India and Nepal, despite controversies that have been raised over some aspects of those, have always helped in giving immense benefits to the farmers, for hydropower generation, for so many other aspects. I mean, and I would say still, I mean, the Mahakali Treaty, I would say, is probably the most progressive treaty that the any two set of countries have signed in this whole region. And it's really, I think, a travesty that movement has not really happened along. And that is partly due to, I think, all the controversies around the earlier treaties, But I would like to see a lot more, I think, the socio-economic and socio-ecological concerns really emerging in the future discourse of this basin, because that is what will really determine, it is the, the future for us. Not so much really, I think, sticking to this rigid nature. I mean, one of the questions, for example, Facebook is, can India scrap the Indus Water Treaty? I mean, there is no exit clause for either of the two countries to really scrap it. And what do you mean by scrap? I mean, what do India do? How will it hold back waters which are flowing in the rivers? They will continue to flow. I mean, India doesn't even use the current quota that it has of the treaty. So the water anyway is flowing. So, I mean, there is nothing, practically speaking, nature doesn't give you an option to scrap the treaty. I mean, seriously, So I think the idea should be, how can we really, I think, maybe not get into this contested space of trying to amend the treaty, but can we really do additional agreements on issues such as climate change, such as on enhancing socio-economic or socio-ecological benefits, I think, waterways. So can we do more one-to-one, agreements between the two countries to really work that out? I think that is something which will be much more important. The last point, and I think which Srinivas kind of bit alluded to, but didn't really bring it out completely, is I think what really was the role played by the respective states and provinces during the negotiation of the treaty? Because the three players really stand out. I mean, India, Pakistan, and the World Bank. And I think there's a lot of discourse in the book about those three dominant players. And obviously, legally speaking, those were the three players. But informally, was there a strong role played by the different states? Because we are seeing now, I think the states themselves, I mean, look at Punjab abrogating the whole Bhakra Byas agreement that it had with Haryana and Rajasthan. We are still seeing Kashmir complaining that it really got the short end of the stick in this whole treaty, whereas the plain states really received all the benefits. Its waters were just, given to Pakistan, so to say, And I think it'd be interesting it's sometime in the future to really understand what was the role played by the states, but more importantly, what can be the constructive role and constructive, I think, discourse between the states and the national bodies that can now determine the future going ahead. So I think let me just stop there. Except for one last point, I would say, I think this is an example of a very good example. I think Dr. Upreti was really talking about this, what lessons that will bring about for other countries. I think in any highly politically contested space, for example, Nile River, what I would say, the Nile Basin, for example, we've seen agreements being signed, violated, Egypt threatening to, wage a war. I think the structure of this treaty, making it so rigid, one, two, there being a dispute resolution mechanism. I think these two key features of this treaty really offer lessons. What should be the necessary ingredients in any treaty that you will negotiate in a hotly contested space, politically contested space? I think these are the two key ingredients that this treaty offers, and that is the reason why it has withstood what I would say wars, and we celebrate 60 years this year, so a diamond jubilee, so to say, of this. And I think those two lessons are very, very important, beyond this region, I think across all the contested basins for the world. So I'll stop with that, and really thank you very much once again for this opportunity to be here, and share my views. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta, for your comments. Now we'd like to open the floor for discussion. Since we have limited time, roughly 10 minutes, we'll take only selected few questions, and I'll raise all the questions so that every participant can give their view. So let me say the questions that I have received. I'll take 3 to 4 questions. First is like Mr. Gupta has partially answered it. Can India scrap the Indus-Water Treaty? If scrapped, what will be the consequences? How much will it impact Pakistan? That is the first question. Second is role of civil engineers during the partition, and what will happen on the Indus-Water Treaty now? And third is Indus originates in China. Indus originates in China while the Chenab and Jhelum originates in India. In this context, does China have any role, or can it play any role in this treaty in future? So these are the few questions that I've raised. Let me follow the same order. First we'll go to Dr. Uttam Sinha, and then Dr. Upreti and the others. So Dr. Sinha.
But very quickly on the engineering perspective and the engineers during the time of the partition, as has been mentioned by the discussion, I think this was one area where it's not been much covered. And they did have a significant role, and that comes out in the book, I think. And also, as Sanjay was mentioning, while the 3 principal actors were India, Pakistan, and the World Bank, I think there was a lot of role played by Punjab and Bikaner as well in sort of influencing the political leadership. And we have, of course, engineers like Swarup Singh in Punjab and engineers like Kumar in Bikaner, who strongly influenced the way the Indian political leadership would look at the Indus-Basin as a strategic value. And there is a lot of account of that, especially the account of Kanwar Sen, and he's the chief engineer of the Bikaner Principality. And there is a point in time during the partition process when the Maharaja Sadul Singh of Bikaner actually forces upon Nehru and Mountbatten that if he doesn't get the requisite supply of water to his state, he would rather go on the other side, that is towards Pakistan. So such was the significance of water in even determining how states would be on this side of the Radcliffe or on that side of the Radcliffe. I think East Punjab, to also answer Sanjay's point of view, and the correspondence that goes on between Nehru and the chief minister there is quite striking, because while Nehru had a worldview, which of course he espoused very articulately, the Punjab, the East Punjab engineers were far more localized and very determined that the water remains on their side, because they valued agricultural produce. And also the partition was quite bitter for many of the Punjabis, and they viewed the river as a way in which probably they could, in certain sense, have a revenge on what was happening. So I think it was far more passionate in Punjab, in East Punjab. And often when Nehru would exude this over exuberance of peace, it would not very gel with the local engineers in Punjab. So I think that is an important part of the book, which I would suggest people really to look at and understand the partition and how East Punjab and how Bikaner were playing an important role. In fact, such influential was their role that the Radcliffe line itself was shifted towards India, which we now understand how critical that has been strategically, not only for maintaining the roads to Kashmir, but also in terms of controlling the headworks. On the treaty, whether it should be abrogated or not, as Sanjay said, and as the treaty says, there is no exit clause. The treaty is very rigid. I think the idea is really not to think in terms of abrogation, but to think in terms of bolstering the treaty, bringing in certain new knowledge, more new ideas. And this treaty has remained rigid because the politics has remained rigid. Imagine if this treaty was between the United States and Canada, we would have been talking about this treaty as the most wonderful treaty, right? Because there would have been flexibility in doing things. And remember, this treaty does have Article 7, which talks about future cooperation. But the politics is so entrenched that it makes everything very rigid. And therefore, things become very difficult to work in terms of the future of this treaty. And I think these were the 2 points which I wanted to really put forward.
Thank you, sir. Now, may I request Dr. Bishnu Upreti if he has to add anything?
I don't have much to add. Only one thing I want to emphasize is about the water cooperation. Irrespective of what sort of tension the Indian and Pakistani leaders have, what sort of dismay they have, at the end, the Indus river is the reality, and they have to live with it. Sooner or later, they have to come to compromise. So, at that context, the very right thing, in my opinion, is to materialize this Article 7 of the treaty, to find the concerted action, collaboration, and work on that. Perhaps at this stage, there can be different arguments, but at the end, it has been almost everywhere proven that war and tension doesn't lead to solve the water crisis. Water crisis is always solved by the cooperation and collaboration and concerted action and exploring the possibilities, using the technological knowledge and technology to make the water use efficiency and so forth and so on. So in that sense, I don't really think that whether the political decision maker of the countries, both countries, decide to abrogate or amend, it's up to them. We can't say anything. But if they opt for that path, it may not really lead to any solution. And the very pragmatic way suggested by the former speaker was to amend the treaty or add some specific provision, and at that time it may work and it may even help for the collaboration. So that is how I see about that. Being outsider and less emotionally attached in that process, for me, it's easy to say and explain it should go in that way. But when listening to the very intimate debate of those who are engaged in this process is somehow different. Anyway, so that is my very clear perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Upreti. Dr. Srinivas, would you like to add?
Well, I just wanted to supplement on what has been said by Sanjay and Uttam about the subnational actors and how they played the role in shaping it. I think, in fact, just to continue that conversation and how important, I think, if you look at it, the 1920 tripartite agreement between Bahawalpur, Deccan and Sindh, that was the kind of defining point about how you have to bring in these subnational actors when these conversations happen. And they did so very assertively. In fact, as Uttam mentioned about it, while Nehru and Liaquat Khan were about to find peace or otherwise agreement, the subnational actors were playing their own role in increasing the tensions. In fact, the West Punjab has always accused East Punjab about holding the waters and not honoring the 1948 standstill agreement, in spite of the fact that Nehru was reassuring them that it is being honored. So I think that that subnational sovereign power that was at play is extremely important even now in that sense. In fact, something that we have been working on, hypothetical argument, is that every outcome and the international borders when it comes to transboundary governance is shaped by the subnational dynamics of water sharing or water conflicts. And you can make an argument across the board, in fact, not just on the western border, but also across the other borders that India is working with its own neighbors. Having said that, I just wanted to reiterate, it's about the engineers. I think just wanted to re-stress that point about bringing these new rationalities of these engineers and how politics and technologies reproduced each other in shaping the positioning of whether Nehru or otherwise on the other side, even Liaquat Khan's. I think it is a very important very important dimension to this discourse, but has been totally neglected. I think it is very important to unearth this knowledge about how engineers thought about it and how they reconciled with the politics at the time. I think what we have is only very strong, unfortunately engineers are not good at writing their stuff, so it's only Conversane's biography, and then perhaps A.N. Khosala's some of his writings, and then perhaps K.L. Rao kind of people. But then I think we need to encourage and promote more and more archival research to capture this thinking of these engineers who were working at the time, who always assumed that they were above politics. Their rationalities work above politics and always tried to find solutions. I think that tension between politics and technology is a very productive tension that we should actually try using it and unearth that knowledge that we are deprived of at the moment. I think I'll just stop it there. Well, I think, no, if you want me to comment on that abrogation, I think I can't, as you did say, that what needs to be said has already been said. It's just that I just beg to differ on the flexibility part. I think while taking the point that Uttam made about it reads rigid because the politics are rigid. But if you look at the conflicts themselves that we have had with Pakistan so far, over Indus water treaty, whether it is Baglihar or otherwise Kishan Ganga, these conflicts have produced knowledge that set a kind of case law that actually produces an extensive knowledge that would be useful for informing transboundary conversations. And if you look at it, I mean, I'll just give you an example about how both Baglihar as well as Kishan Ganga are about locating sluice gates in this dead storage level. And the both neutral expert as well as the Court of Arbitration has brought out new dimensions, whether it is e-flows or otherwise, whether it is necessary for the treaty to acknowledge the advances in sedimentation engineering. I think even the conflictual relationship, which is rigid, is producing useful knowledge to inform transboundary conversations. I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sanjay Gupta, would you like to add something?
Just I think somebody had raised the issue with the Indus originating in China and South India. I mean, just to make a brief comment, that is, I think, irrelevant to the treaty, because the treaty is very clear. I mean, 3 Western rivers to Pakistan and 3 Indian rivers for India. So it is not really considering the origin of the rivers or, you know, what other countries may do, you know. So that is not really relevant to the treaty. And just continuing, I think, from what Srinivas said about Baglihar and Bishnu, I think those are also good examples of how, I mean, you can actually end up developing, I think, inefficiencies in hydropower, you know, plants, and, you know, you don't really, I mean, go ahead and update simply because there is so much, everything is so much contested, you know, and rather than, I think each country's loss among these 2 countries is seen as the gain of the other. There is actual gain or not. So the other country's loss is my perceived gain, you know, even if I may not materially really gain anything. And I think in that regard is what I said, I mean, why the treaty is really so rigid, because it really doesn't give space for that consultation to move ahead. And I mean, just responding to what Dr. Upreti was saying, I mean, you know, pragmatism really doesn't work, you know, in this space at all. It's really politics, it's really emotions, you know. I mean, if pragmatism were to work, example is, I would say a much smaller example. The bigger example would be transboundary trade between India and Pakistan, which could be worth, you know, probably $40 billion. And right now it is not even $1 million, you know. So, I mean, that is the kind of losses the 2 countries are incurring, you know. I mean, the economic losses the 2 countries are incurring simply because of that rigidity in relations, you know. So I don't really see that happening. You know, I think there'll be other areas in which movement will happen far earlier than actually anything on Indus Treaty in terms of pragmatism. You know. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, Dr. Srinivas, Dr. Bishnu Upreti, Mr. Sanjay Gupta, and dear participants. Here we come to the end of the discussion. We are really thankful to all the speakers and the author. It was enriching discussion and we learned a lot. We'd also like to thank all our audience who are watching us on Zoom, Facebook, and other platforms. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you very much.